Katt, we have an opportunity of peace. I want to be a brother. I want to be a friend. Katt, I want to move on. Can we move on, man? Can we move on?
Kevin Hart hugged Katt Williams live on Netflix after years of bad blood, and for a moment, it looked like the feud was finally over. But minutes later, Kevin said something on that same stage that completely changed how people saw the moment. Now people are asking whether the whole thing was staged from the start. So, what actually happened that night? And why are people suddenly calling the whole thing fake? Join us as we reveal everything about Kevin Hart and Katt Williams' 25-year beef. This beef is older than you think. Most people assume the feud between Kevin Hart and Katt Williams started somewhere around 2016, when Katt began going on radio shows and podcasts, calling Kevin a puppet. Some traced it back to 2018, when Kevin defended his co-star on a breakfast show, and things turned personal. A smaller number pointed to the infamous 2024 Club Shay Shay interview, where Katt lit the internet on fire with accusations that shook Hollywood. But every single one of those people had the timeline wrong. The real origin goes back further, and it started in the strangest possible way. In 2014, a sports reporter asked Katt a simple question about Shaquille O'Neal trying his hand at stand-up comedy. Katt answered by telling Shaquille O'Neal to stay in his lane. Then, completely unprompted, he threw in a reference to Kevin, telling Shaquille O'Neal to back off before he went and took Kevin from him, the way Shaquille O'Neal apparently already had. It was the first time Katt had ever attached Kevin's name to his frustration publicly, and it was almost accidental. Kevin had not even been the subject of the question. Katt had been the dominant short-form black comedian in the industry for years. Kevin was now being positioned for the same lane. That same year, Katt began telling people that he had played a role in Kevin's early development as a comedian, that Kevin had learned from watching him, and that the industry had taken what Katt built and handed it to a younger, more manageable version. This was not said in interviews. It was said privately, in rooms, to people inside the business. Those rooms talk. The story began to move. What made this tension so potent was that it was not just personal. It was structural. Katt was watching a shift in the entertainment industry, where a certain type of performer was being elevated through mainstream platforms, while others with longer track records were being quietly passed over. He believed Kevin was the visible symbol of that shift. Kevin, from his position, was simply doing what comedians do, showing up, saying yes, and building his career one project at a time. For years, this stayed under the surface. There were no public confrontations, no viral moments, just a growing, slow-burning resentment on one side and a rising trajectory on the other. Kevin was filling arenas, headlining studio films, and appearing on magazine covers. Katt, meanwhile, was dealing with a series of personal and professional setbacks that had begun to affect his standing in the industry. By the time Katt started speaking publicly about Kevin in 2016, the frustration had been brewing for nearly a decade. The puppet comment that year was not an impulse. It was years of private resentment spilling into public view. Katt called Kevin an industry plant, a puppet of the Hollywood machine, a comedian who had been artificially elevated by powerful people who used him to serve their own interests. He challenged Kevin to a comedy face-off in Kevin's own hometown of Philadelphia, offering a significant sum of money for the confrontation, publicly daring Kevin to show up and prove himself on a stage without the backing of studios or networks. Kevin did not take the bait. He stayed quiet, kept working, and kept filling venues. The frustration that had started as a private industry whisper had turned into one of the most talked-about rivalries in modern comedy. Real admiration was buried underneath the conflict. People who knew both men said privately that Katt had genuine respect for Kevin's work ethic, even while questioning the conditions that made his rise possible. Kevin had never written Katt off either. He had spoken publicly about being a fan first. He had said Katt was one of the most gifted comedians he had ever watched work. But admiration and grievance do not cancel each other out, and for these two men, they had been coexisting, unresolved, for close to 20 years. Just when it seemed like this rivalry would quietly fade, Katt went fully public, and what he said and did next turned a private industry grudge into one of the most documented feuds in comedy history. So what finally pushed Katt to go fully public, and how far was he willing to go? The puppet, the plant, the $5 million dare. The 2024 Club Shay Shay interview was not Katt's first public strike at Kevin. It was the loudest one, but the escalation had been building in stages for years. In 2016, Katt made his first major public move. He gave a series of interviews in which he referred to Kevin as a puppet, someone whose strings were being pulled by powerful figures in Hollywood who had decided he was the right face to push to the top. The puppet label was deliberate. It was designed to suggest that Kevin's success was not earned in the traditional sense, but manufactured, controlled, and managed by industry gatekeepers who had agendas of their own. Katt did not stop at the label. He issued a direct challenge. He called Kevin out publicly, inviting him to a 5-part showdown in Philadelphia, Kevin's hometown. The challenge included a comedy set, a basketball game, a boxing match, a rap cipher, and a second comedy set. Katt attached a significant financial figure to each event, telling Kevin to bring his share in cash. Kevin declined. He said nothing publicly and kept working. His silence on the challenge only seemed to fuel Katt further. The absence of a response was itself treated as a form of response. Over the next 2 years, Katt continued making his case on various platforms, sharpening the argument each time. Kevin was not a real comic who had earned his way up. Kevin was a product. Kevin had been handed a career that Katt and others like him had built the road for. Then 2018 arrived, and something changed. Kevin had been staying quiet through all of it, operating under the philosophy that engaging publicly with Katt served no useful purpose. But in 2018, Katt shifted his target. He went after Tiffany Haddish, Kevin's co-star in their upcoming film Night School. Katt went on a radio show and questioned Tiffany's talent, her credibility, and her rise. He made comments about her appeal to certain audiences that were pointed and personal. When Kevin heard it, he broke his silence. Kevin appeared on a breakfast radio program and spoke directly about his frustration with Katt. He said Katt had been given every opportunity, had been the guy at one point, had been positioned to be the biggest name in comedy, and had chosen repeatedly not to show up. Kevin said Katt missed shots, made himself unavailable to studios, and became a liability that the industry could no longer absorb. In a subsequent interview, Kevin said that engaging with Katt had been a mistake, that there was no return on investment in that kind of public exchange, and that he would not do it again. Katt did not stop. The years that followed brought more interviews, more accusations, and more platforms willing to give him time to make his case. By the time the 2024 Club Shay Shay interview arrived, Katt had spent years constructing a detailed argument that Kevin was an industry plant who had never earned a standing ovation at a comedy club, who had never sold out a show on the strength of his comedy alone, and who had been propped up by the same powerful machinery that Katt had always refused to serve. Katt also alleged that for 5 years, every major film Kevin starred in had first been offered to him, and that he had turned each one down on principle. It was that specific claim that Kevin would return to later. Clips circulated for weeks. People who had never closely followed either man were suddenly invested in the outcome. Kevin responded to the noise with something close to indifference. He told a journalist that Katt's commentary was entertainment, that he wished him well, and that he had nothing more to say about it. To one news outlet, he said he did not entertain the circus. He watched it. He said his career was documented, his work was visible, and anyone who wanted to research the plant accusation could do so themselves. Behind the scenes, something more complicated was developing. People in their shared orbit were paying close attention. The feud had reached a level of public intensity that was becoming difficult to absorb without someone stepping in, and eventually, someone did. He had no stake in either man's career, had never taken a side publicly, and had spent years watching the whole thing from a careful distance. What he did next was not what anyone expected. The person who stepped in was not a manager, not a publicist, and not a lawyer. It was a comedian, and the words he used hit both men exactly where they lived. So who finally got through to both of them? And why did it take someone with absolutely no stake in the outcome? Dave Chappelle did something nobody expected. While the internet was busy picking sides in the Kevin versus Katt feud, Dave Chappelle was doing something different. He was not posting about it, not giving interviews about it, not being pulled into it the way public figures usually get dragged into someone else's conflict. He was simply watching, and at some point, he decided that watching was no longer enough. What Dave did was unusual. He addressed the feud publicly, but not through a statement or a curated post. He addressed it at a comedy club, in a video that eventually began circulating, alongside comedian Day Davis. He addressed it at a comedy club, in a video filmed alongside comedian Day Davis, another black comic who had worked alongside both men in the industry, that eventually began circulating online. Dave spoke about Katt specifically. He told Katt that he was a genius. Then he told him to stop drawing ugly pictures of the people around him. He said that black comedians at that level had to stick together because they were all they had. He framed the entire conflict not as a legitimate grievance, but as self-destruction dressed up as righteous criticism. Dave had enormous credibility in the comedy world. He was not seen as someone who took sides in other people's disputes, and he was not someone who could be easily dismissed. When he spoke about the industry, people listened, including Katt. Dave did not let Kevin entirely off the hook either. He pointed out that the public attacks and counterattacks between the two men had been serving nobody. He questioned what it accomplished for either of them to keep fighting publicly when the real beneficiaries of that fight were platforms and audiences who were entertained by the conflict without having any real stake in its resolution. The video moved through comedy circles quickly. Dave's framing was specific and difficult to dismiss. He was not asking Katt to pretend the grievances did not exist. He was asking whether the public warfare was actually addressing those grievances or simply performing them for an audience with no real stake in the outcome. Behind the public comments, Dave began working more quietly. People close to the situation said he spent time in conversations reminding both Kevin and Katt that their individual legacies were tied to something larger than any conflict between them. The comedians who had come before them had fought for access, for visibility, for the right to exist on mainstream stages at all. Katt and Kevin were both products of that history, and the ongoing public war between them was cheapening what both of them had spent decades building. Katt did not suddenly change his position. Kevin did not reach out. But the temperature dropped. The public exchanges became less frequent. The viral clip cycle that had been running continuously began to slow. Then came the announcement that Netflix would be staging a live roast of Kevin as part of the Netflix is a Joke Festival in 2026. The event was set for the Kia Forum in Los Angeles on May 10th. For 3 nights before that, from May 7th through May 9th, Dave himself was running a residency called Pulling Up at the Hollywood Palladium. Those nights were billed as stand-up shows, but they were a preamble. Dave was using them, according to people close to the situation, to keep both men in the same social orbit in the days immediately before the roast. Nobody outside a very small circle knew who all the guests would be. Netflix had not released a full lineup. Names were being speculated about, familiar roast figures, celebrity friends of Kevin's, people who had a history with him in the industry. Almost nobody was expecting the name that eventually walked through the curtain 2 hours into the broadcast. The production team had spent weeks in what one participant described as a group brainstorm about who would make the night genuinely unpredictable. Kevin was involved in those conversations directly, and he had a clear sense of what would make extraordinary television. He had pushed for something that would put real discomfort in the room, the kind that required a guest nobody was fully prepared for. Dave had done his part. What happened the moment that the guest appeared at the Kia Forum was something the audience, the cameras, and even the seasoned performers already on stage were not prepared for. So, who walked through that curtain, and what exactly were they about to say? Katt Williams walked in wearing a cape. Regina Hall was mid-set when she paused and introduced a name that sent a visible shock through the arena. Katt walked out onto the stage at the Kia Forum dressed in a cape, moving with the kind of deliberate energy that left nothing to chance. What had been a celebratory roast environment shifted into something harder to categorize. This was the arrival of the one person Kevin had spent years carefully avoiding, now standing less than 20 feet away from him on live national television. Jeff Ross, present throughout the evening as Roastmaster General, later described the moment as the only point during the entire 3-hour broadcast where he felt genuine tension in the room. He said Kevin visibly stiffened and that the mood changed in a way that none of the other guest appearances had produced. Katt wasted no time. He moved directly into his set without any warm-up, without acknowledging the audience's reaction or playing into the spectacle of his own entrance. His opening salvo landed immediately. He told the crowd that he was surprised he had even been invited, given how little star power Kevin apparently possessed. He said the invitation itself was evidence of Kevin's diminished pull. He said he had made his feelings about Kevin very clear before agreeing to come, and that the show had told him to come anyway. The crowd roared. Before he got into the grievances, Katt had something to say about why he had shown up at all. He told the crowd he had come for the money. Then he said that he made the roast his own version of the Riyadh Comedy Festival, with one difference. In 2025, Kevin had performed at a Saudi government-sponsored comedy festival in Riyadh that drew significant public criticism from other comedians and human rights organizations. Saudi Arabia's record on free speech, the treatment of women, and the criminalization of homosexuality made the festival a flashpoint for comedians who felt performing there sent the wrong message. Katt had refused to go. Standing on the Netflix stage, he said his version was the only one that had a soul. The line landed hard. Several other performers that night had already taken shots at Kevin for the Riyadh appearance, but none had framed it the way Katt did, as the explanation for why he himself was there. He went from there into a decade of grievances. He revisited the industry plant argument, but reframed it with a piece of observed logic that the crowd found undeniable. He said he had been trying to bury Kevin publicly for years, and Kevin kept returning stronger each time. He said that behavior was precisely consistent with what a plant does. He said the comparison was not an insult. It was, he argued, simply an accurate description of what he had been witnessing for over a decade. The puppet label came next. He had used that word previously to criticize Kevin's relationship with the Hollywood system. On that stage, he offered a clarification that he framed as a correction, but was actually a deepening of the original accusation. He said the word had been interpreted as a general criticism about Kevin's independence when what he had actually meant was something far more specific. He gestured toward Netflix's chief executive, who was seated in the audience that night, and connected that presence directly to the label he had been using for years. The crowd, which included the executive in question, erupted. He moved to the most dangerous material available in the room. Kevin had been publicly connected to events hosted by Diddy before his arrest and the subsequent federal charges against him. Diddy had been indicted on serious charges, including trafficking, and several of the events he had hosted were at the center of the investigation. Kevin had attended some of those events in earlier years. Katt told the audience that simply attending those events did not mean Kevin had done anything wrong. Then he said that the reason Kevin became quiet and uncomfortable whenever the subject came up was itself the evidence that something had indeed been wrong. The crowd's reaction landed in layers. Laughter first, then a visible discomfort, the kind a room produces when something crosses a line on live television in front of millions of people. Through all of it, Kevin sat in his chair at the center of the stage. The cameras caught his face throughout the entire set. He laughed at certain moments. He absorbed others with something closer to complete stillness. He did not interrupt, did not walk off, and did not react in any way that gave Katt an obvious target. When Katt finished, critics called it the most precise set of the night. The whole night. One reviewer called his material the leanest and most economical of the night. Another named him the clear MVP of an event that included some of the most recognizable names in entertainment. Kevin stood up from his chair and walked directly toward him. What Kevin said in that moment, with the cameras running, the crowd watching, and 25 years of unresolved conflict sitting between them, was something nobody in that building had scripted. And what happened in the 60 seconds that followed would become one of the most replayed moments in live television history, right up until Kevin walked to the microphone later that night and completely reframed every second of it. The confession and the question that changed everything. Kevin did not wait for a signal or look off stage for direction. He stood up from his chair and walked directly to Katt. He stopped, looked at him, and didn't soften a single word. He acknowledged the years of conflict between them plainly. He told Katt that seeing him walk out that night had been a genuine surprise, and that sitting through the entire set had reminded him that he had been a fan of Katt's work long before any of the tension between them existed. Then he said he wanted it to be over. He said this was the moment. Right there, live, in front of everybody. He said he was offering an olive branch. He said he wanted to be brothers. He said he wanted to leave 25 years of conflict behind and move forward. For a moment, Katt said nothing. He stood at the microphone and looked at Kevin across the stage. The room went quiet in a way it had not been quiet all night. Katt walked toward him. He extended his hand. Kevin took it. They shook hands and embraced. The Kia Forum erupted. Not polite applause. The kind of noise a crowd makes when something real just happened, and they all know it. Jeff, watching from the side of the stage, later said the tension in the room evaporated at the exact moment Kevin asked for the hatchet to be buried. Everything that had been charged and uncertain turned into something that felt, briefly, like a celebration. Then Kevin's closing set arrived. Kevin had spent hours sitting through a roasting from a lineup that included Tom Brady, Dwayne Johnson, Pete Davidson, Chelsea Handler, Lizzo, and a full roster of celebrity performers, each taking their turn to dismantle him, and he had taken all of it without visible damage. Now it was his turn, and he used his time deliberately. He went back to Katt first. He reminded the audience that every performer on that stage had spent the night making the same argument, that Kevin could not act. He directed their attention specifically to the moment where he had walked across the stage, taken Katt's hand, looked him directly in the eyes, and delivered his entire speech about wanting peace and brotherhood. He said it was the finest acting of his professional career, that he had not meant a single word. He said it again, louder, and the crowd came apart. He followed that confession by working methodically through the list of films Katt had allegedly passed on before Kevin eventually starred in them. He named them individually: 3 Jumanji films, 2 Ride-Along films, Central Intelligence, Think Like a Man, a string of commercially successful studio projects. He then noted what Katt had chosen to do instead: a small supporting appearance in Norbit, the 2007 Eddie Murphy comedy that had been critically dismissed on release and had since become a punchline of its own. He pointed out that the character Katt had built his image around would not have been a fit for any of those productions, regardless of scheduling. Then, before the laughter from that sequence had settled, he pivoted again. He said the beef was over. He said he meant it. He said Katt had shown up that night and delivered something that genuinely impressed him, and that he was glad Katt had been in the building. He said Katt had shown out. He declared peace, then blew it up, then declared it again, and nobody in that building could tell where the joke ended. Months before the roast, Kevin had told Carmelo Anthony on his podcast 7 p.m. in Brooklyn that picking up the phone and talking directly to Katt, without intermediaries, had changed things between them. He had said that as both men had gotten older, they had gotten better at having honest conversations. Both things were on record, and neither one fully canceled the other. If Kevin had already been quietly rebuilding a real relationship with Katt in the months before the roast, then which part of the night was actually the performance? Was it the hug? Or was the confession that the hug was fake the real cover story, designed to let Kevin keep his pride intact? Share your thoughts with us in the comments section. Remember to like, share, and subscribe for more. Also, click the next video showing on your screen. You will enjoy it.